Hey, in this lecture, I'm going to talk about Free Churro, which is the episode in which Bojack gives the eulogy for his mom. I think now that I've watched it a few times that this is my favorite episode of the entire series. It's just endlessly moving and rich, and we won't be able to talk about all of the nuance in it because that's impossible. Watch it when you're feeling resilient because it's a really rough episode to watch. Okay, so Bojack's mother has died. I think it's an interesting choice that the show made not to let us see this death or tell us that it happened. We only find out after the fact that she's dead. And there are a whole bunch of issues that this episode raises for us, philosophically speaking. One thing I'm interested in here that we don't get to talk about this in the rest of the season, is the way that voice and speech work in the episode. So there are a number of interesting things to be said here. So first of all, notice that throughout the entire episode, we hear only one voice the entire time. The opening monologue is given by Bojack's father, but that's the same voice actor, as I'm sure you've noticed. So the voice of Bojack's father is going for the first 3 minutes or so, and then the rest of the episode, we hear only Bojack speaking. So it's really just that one single voice the entire time. Also, notice an interesting fact that we see really vividly here, which is that Bojack almost never speaks to his dad. He just listens when his dad talks. So the fact that they have the same voice almost never comes up, because when his dad's talking, Bojack just sits very passively and listens and is silent, which is also significant in terms of what happens in the rest of this episode. So there's no voices other than that one. But there are other voice-like things that function in the speech that makes up this episode. In particular, on the one hand, you have the musical instruments. So there's somebody in the background who we never see who is giving little musical interjections, drums and trumpet and so on, throughout Bojack's speech. And Bojack turns those little instrumental interjections into conversational moves very explicitly. He asks the instrumentalist to give him certain sorts of recognition and uptake, and then complains when it's the wrong kind, and it's very clear that the instruments are functioning as part of the conversation. We also hear the vague rustling and reactions of the audience, who we don't see until the very end, and they function as a kind of a speech in the course of the episode. And most interestingly, I think the silence of his mother functions as part of the conversation, but only because Bojack makes it do so. And because several times during the episode, Bojack turns to the coffin and addresses her and says things like, "Knock once if you're proud of me." There's a whole series of "knock once if" lines. And of course, whenever he says to the casket, "Knock once if you're," there's no response. There's only silence. Of course there's only silence because the person inside the casket is dead. And it's not even his mother, as we find out later. Right? But in any case, the casket isn't going to speak back. So Bojack knows that his knock once moves are going to be greeted by silence. All the same, he uses those moments of silence to construct a kind of a conversation between him and his mom. And so it's fascinating to me the way silence can actually be a conversational move. This is true in everyday conversation too, right? If you and I are talking and I ask you something and you remain silent, your silence isn't just neutral. Your silence is a kind of a response to what I said. Your refusal to answer is a kind of a response to what I said, and it shapes the conversation. So in that sense, silence can be what philosophers call a speech act, right? A piece of the conversation that does some work in terms of shaping how the conversation goes. This is a particularly interesting case of silence because it's only part of the conversation because Bojack makes it so, right? A coffin sitting there saying nothing doesn't usually count as a conversational move, but because Bojack is asking her questions and going out of his way to highlight the silence that comes afterwards, he constructs that silence into part of the conversation that he's having. And I think that tells us something interesting about how language works. But ultimately, of course, unlike in a normal conversation, he's just conversing with himself. And this is highlighted by the fact that not only is he the only voice, And he's the one who turns the silences and the instrumentation into parts of the conversation. It's not actual interventions from somebody else. It's him creating that. But so he's just conversing with himself in that sense, but he's also just conversing with himself in the sense that we figure out at the end that he has been paying so little attention to his audience that he hasn't even noticed that he's in the wrong room and that he's speaking to a room full of geckos who have no idea who he is or what he's talking about. So he's not responsive to his audience in the way that normally one would be in a conversation. So in that sense, it's just a monologue. And it's a monologue that parallels the monologue that his father gives him at the beginning. And I think this is really important, right? So in the opening scene, we see his father talking to Bojack as if they're having a conversation, and yet it's not a two-way conversation. His dad is doing all the talking, and he's not in any way responsive to how Bojack is giving uptake to what he's saying or listening or anything like that. So it's a monologue that is portraying itself as if it's a dialogue or a conversation. And then we go right from there into Bojack doing the very same thing, right? Giving a monologue and structuring it as though it's a conversation and as though he's talking to an audience, but actually really just talking to and for himself. So the language in this episode doesn't function as a normal conversation. However, it does function as a kind of a poem. I would spend much more time on this if this were a literature class rather than a philosophy class, because I think there's a lot to be said here that's interesting. But pay attention really carefully to the dialogue in this episode. Notice how it's rhythmic and goes in circles. Notice how he comes back over and over again to particular themes and particular lines, right? The knock once format shows up over and over again at regular intervals. And the other kinds of voices that Bojack brings in, the instruments and the silences, they don't contribute to the meaning of the conversation because they don't actually have any conversational content, but they do give rhythm and form to the speech. It's a really carefully constructed episode in that sense. This brings us back to the theme of recognition that we've already been talking about, right? Conversations by their nature are supposed to involve mutual attention and recognition, which is what allows them to go back and forth, right? I say something to you, and then I watch and see and how you respond, and I listen to your response, and you respond to me, and that shapes what I say next. And there's a back and forth that depends on that mutual recognition, and that's how they work. This is an odd conversation because Bojack has constructed all the parts and all the players, and ultimately he's not doing that back and forth thing at all, right? He's not engaging in any responsive recognition of anybody else or anything else. Even his little call-outs to his mom, his requests for her to knock once if she's proud of him and so forth, are of course already designed in advance not to be answered. It's not like he thinks she's actually going to say something that he needs to pay attention to. Okay. Recognition, I think, is a major theme in this episode, as it is in the entire series. Another way in which this comes up, which is really powerful and structures the whole eulogy, is Bojack thinks at the beginning of his speech that he's had one of these major moments of recognition and connection with his mother. Right? His whole life, his mother has refused to connect with him. He's felt like she has refused to recognize him as who he really is. And while she had dementia, she wouldn't even call him by his name. Right? She constantly called him Henrietta, and he's been constantly frustrated by this sense of lack of connection. But he thinks that at the last moment, they had a moment of connection. She looks at him and she says, "I see you." And he takes this as defining their whole relationship and giving it a kind of a closure that he wasn't expecting to get. Although over the course of the episode, that reading of the situation is going to get undone. Right? So he thinks that he's had this very literal moment of connection through recognition where she looks at him and she says, "I see you." But remember, back in season 1, I said to pay attention to the fact that whenever Bojack thinks he's had a moment of connection with his mother, it always turns out to be based on a miscommunication and an illusion. So in this case, what his mother was actually doing, he realizes, is reading the letters "I see you" off of the wall of the intensive care unit, and she wasn't recognizing him at all. So on the one hand, there's this irony that he's trying to find some sort of closure to this whole lifetime of lack of recognition in this one little moment at the end. And then on the other hand, there's the even greater irony that that moment turns out not to be real. Right? There was no connection, there was no recognition. But to be fair, he's done the same thing to her, right? She didn't recognize him, but he is not recognizing her now either. He doesn't give her the open casket that she asks for, right? She asks to be seen after she dies, quite literally, to have people see her. And he refuses that request by refusing to have an open casket funeral. So he's refusing to give her the recognition that she asked for, which is totally fair, to be frank, given how she's treated him his whole life. Right? But he also doesn't notice that the audience is geckos. He doesn't take the time to even look in the casket and notice that it's not his mother's body in there. So his lack of recognition is profound. And this is, of course, the same thing that his dad does to him in the car. Right? His dad shows no recognition of the impact of his words on Bojack. He just goes off on his own monologue. So there's all of these moments of misrecognition going on at the same time as there's this ongoing theme of how much we want recognition. Okay, let me pause there.